Good morning. Warmly welcome to Saturday at Work. Welcome to November 2nd on a rainy day. If you have a little more time, it's a rainy day, you might find the desire within you to watch, because I've been collecting various information on the side lately. And it turned out that I gathered enough for a nice piece related to the Russian economy. Just write it down, paint it out. Because there are both myths and facts in life, I hope that this detailed comparison, looking at the major points and insights, it will be interesting. I won't overdo the length, and it will be quite nice. And to all those watching, I warmly welcome you and encourage you to watch the material. Like, comment, share, subscribe to the channel, and give advice on ads. To all those who support the channel, I sincerely thank you and invite you to continue collaborating. And my dear, this Russian bear with a cigarette on the lip with all those toys and acting on the command of the one in the upper left corner, a bit scary, just like the one in the right corner above the bear. Although supposedly this is his likeness, the one on the left, but I don't know. I just took that picture in Ukraine. No matter how you look at it, a lot of people denied. For a long time, what I, along with my colleagues, managed to find, develop, analyze, and present. But finally, that bubble of denial has burst, and now major media are writing about the facts. Indeed, it never happens as quickly as I would like, and contrary to what was recently said by Mike Satoshi, whom I greet, Rafael threw it at me that a year ago I said it would be the end. No, you can check it exactly on Twitter, you can check it on YouTube, because everything is still available. That I said they would have enough time for this and that much longer. That was when I specifically said that for a year and a half. Nothing would change. So we still have all of 2025, during which Russia as such will be able to function with this war. But what will happen afterwards, no one really knows for sure. But I will try to answer that question by providing facts. Most of the information comes from strictly Russian sources. Some from Russian immigrant sources like the Moscow Times, some from Western materials, and some from already developed materials here based on various available sources. Finally, big journalists, major titles, serious people, are starting to write the things that I discussed with my colleagues a year and a half, even 2 years ago. There is a certain satisfaction from this, but you always have to do a little check. So I am checking for myself what those big ones have found at this moment. My dear, I warmly welcome you to this expose on the Russian economy and its implications. This photo is only half of what I would like to show, as it concerns foreign corporations operating in Russia. But before I just go specifically into this, I will quote a little bit more in detail to you how some of these myths sound like regarding Russia and its condition. First, the sanctions do not work. Second, the sanctions only strengthen Russia as it develops what it cannot import from the West. Russia is expanding its influence. 4, Russia is developing faster and faster. 5, Russia's economic growth is a fact. Answer for yourselves. Based on what I will present to you, are these just myths and wet dreams of the Kremlin tenant? Does this have anything to do with the law? And if so, to what extent? That answer belongs to you. I will provide how it is according to me. And now, foreign companies that want to leave Russia will be forced to pay higher tax on exit. I felled Lisowski many times about when we talked about what it was like, and he kept growing more and more. And now the question is whether this exit tax to discourage leaving is meant to completely rob these Western corporations or to hide the fact that they have already been completely plundered. Anything is possible. So this exit tax and voluntary contribution to the state treasury As Finance Minister Anton Siluanov said on Thursday, they are to be a fact and confirm earlier reports about the planned increase of these fees. The discount for foreigners will increase from 50% to 60%, said Siluanov to journalists, who heads the Government Investment Commission that approves the sale of foreign assets. Meanwhile, mandatory contributions to the Russian treasury are going up immediately from 15% to 25%, which is plus 5% in 1 year and 5% in the next year, totaling 35%. So down here and up here. Well, that's nice. Siluanov did not comment on last week's reports that President Putin personally approved a contract worth over 50 billion rubles, or $530 million. I would say it's a small detail compared to what it was. Hundreds of mainly Western companies have either fully withdrawn or reduced their operations in Russia following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Recently, the largest company exiting Russia is Oshon. Well, then I'm still waiting for information about Leroy. And Moscow introduced steep mandatory discounts in the same year. From the value that exiting companies must provide and charged a fee for exiting those companies, these numbers have been gradually, all the time, raised step by step, as Western companies remaining in Russia faced criticism that their exit would help finance the Russian war economy. Meanwhile, the Russians decided to strike at one of the icons of Western corporations, namely JP, Morgan Chase and Co. What did the Russians decide to do? Well, that bank will definitely remember them, and it will speak well of it. A Russian court ordered the seizure of JP Morgan Chase's assets as part of a lawsuit against the second largest Russian bank, VTB, in Nishtor Bank, in connection with the lawsuit to recover funds blocked abroad due to sanctions. This was reported on Friday by the Reiter agency, citing court documents. The arbitration court in St. Petersburg ruled that it seizes $155.8 million in any currency from all JP Morgan bank accounts. Furthermore, the court noted that the confiscation of assets does not affect funds held in so-called Type C accounts, which cannot be transferred out of Russia, but also cannot be seized under presidential decrees. VTB filed cases in October. It sought compensation from 9 defendants also linked to JP Morgan, including its Russian subsidiary, JP Morgan International. The U.S. Department of the Treasury sanctioned VTB in February 2022 in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Since then, JP Morgan has faced several legal challenges related to its Russian transactions and interests. JP Morgan reported that its available assets in Russia were lower than the value of claims and freezes made against it, which VTB claims amount to only $440 million of VTB's frozen assets in the US. So either way, the Russians are at a loss. However, Reiter previously reported, citing court documents, that 204.7 billion rubles out of 243 billion rubles held by JP Morgan in Russia are in Type C accounts, meaning they will only be able to access a small portion of that. So I expect that VTB, as a politically strong bank well connected with people in power in Russia, will do everything to change the law in order to access those Type C accounts. Of course, this will provoke further retaliation from Western corporations and the countries in which they are located. I really like this, such a little war, and it's already quite a tough little war. And here we have Nabulina, a woman who really knows how to manage the institution she heads, which is the Central Bank of Russia. Elvira is really a good player, but her options are also running out, especially if the government and government services have a different approach than the tasks in the institution she leads. So the head of the Central Bank of Russia calls for a tough fight against inflation. Elvira warned, major monetary policy changes may be needed. Current 21% level of basic interest rates. The official appeared in the Duma before a group of deputies a week after the central bank raised the rediscount rate to a record 21%. This is more than the interest rate considered a rescue issue at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which was then 20% rescue. With high inflation, economic growth unfortunately cannot be sustainable. It is a dangerous illusion that increased inflation can be maintained at a certain level in the long term. Therefore, we do not plan any cuts to achieve our target of 4%. The target is 4%, the inflation target. She said this as a spokesperson who defended the central bank's monetary policy in this way. She called this policy an inevitable response to what is happening in the economy. So, things are going badly in the economy, right? And this is said by the head of the central bank. The central bank announced last Friday that the price increase in September was 9.8% year on year. In August, this rate was 7.5, which means it is accelerating. This is 1/4 of the rate. The so-called core inflation rose to 9.1%, while in August it was 7.7%. At the end of the year, according to the latest update, the Central Bank of Russia predicts an inflation level of 8 to 8.5%. Meanwhile, the original inflation target for this year was set at 6.57 under current conditions. Restrictive monetary policy does not contradict any developmental goals that the government is currently working on. A very ambitious text. It protects salaries, pensions, benefits, and citizens' savings from rising prices, especially savings. I am waiting for them to be converted into bonds. This is how Anna Bulina argued. The draft budget of Russia for 2025, presented by the parliament in the first reading last week, predicts that 1/3 of state expenditures, or 6.3% of GDP, will be allocated for military purposes. This is the highest since the Cold War, when the USSR still existed. As emphasized by the émigré Russian portal, the Moscow Times, in a situation where the state is the main source of expenditures in the country, raising interest rates may not be an effective means of combating inflation. A trivially simple statement, but so true. Raising interest rates may not be an effective means of combating inflation. This may correspond with Bulina's statement in the Duma. She stated that interest rates are the main tool in the fight against inflation. But for the economic policy of the authorities to work under current conditions, more drastic changes are needed. And here I wonder what drastic changes we are talking about. So this will be the raid on the deposits of ordinary Russians. I wouldn't be surprised at all. It is also possible that they will carry out a denomination which will calm the currency exchange, during which probably 25% of people won't manage to do it, and the money will be evaporated, so to speak. Anything is possible, but let's move on. As part of this, moving on, Russia recently made significant amendments to its tax system. And everyone needs to be convinced, educated, and intimidated about this. And this is, for example, what the tax forum of the Chamber of Industry and Commerce, which recently took place in Moscow, was for. A forum during which representatives of the Federal Tax Service discussed the details of changes in the tax system being introduced from next year. With business representatives and experts, the discussion concerned the application, particularly by entrepreneurs, of these changes. Entrepreneurs asked tax officials how exactly the federal investment tax credit and business division amnesty would work. Representatives of the Federal Tax Service did not have answers to all the questions. Some innovations will be developed next year, actually in an experimental mode. In short, it should be interpreted this way. We don't know yet how we will do it, but you still have to comply. We will experiment on you. Cool, cool. Russian businesses are fleeing more. Russian oligarchs are smiling as they report that they have taken all their interests out of Russia. Bravo. The little bear will stay with us for a while longer because the matter is serious. But he corresponds as the force of violence with the Kremlin in the background to what we have here. And here is the statistic. Remember, a certain interesting saying talks about what kind of truths we know. We know the truth. The whole truth, the bullshit truth, and the statistics On top of all that, there is Russian statistics. And if someone likes this picture of statistics, then please, I don't complain. But let's take a look at what follows, because it's quite amusing here. The Russian Statistical Office did not publish detailed data on inflation for September. The Kremlin decided to hide these statistics because prices in Russia are skyrocketing. That's why the central bank raised the main interest rate to 21%, the highest level in 20 years. As noted by the Moscow Times, the overall inflation rate has not been released. It was only published on October 11th. Detailed data, even though almost 3 weeks have passed since then, have not appeared either on the office's website or in the Unified Interdepartmental Information and Statistical System. It concerns precise statistics showing how much the prices of specific goods and services have increased, which are included in its consumer basket. According to the latest data, inflation fell in September to 8.6% from 9% in August. This is already diverging from what I recently told you regarding the central bank itself. And this is the situation. Soaring prices caused the Russian central bank to do what it did. The bank announced in an official statement that inflation is rising due to increased demand, resulting from higher public spending, credit availability, and a shortage of workers. So yes, higher public spending in the form of orders, for example, is reaching additional incentives to join the army through recruitment rates. Credit availability, well, yes, take a loan to equip yourself to go to the army, right? Nice. And the shortage of workers, which is even a topic of what Chermyezov says, the head of Rossetti, a very, very influential person in Russia, because they lack labor force. Therefore, they even claim that it would be good to hire mercenaries from anywhere as long as they don't take people from the industry. Who would have expected that in Russia such things would happen, that there would be a lack of people? Large expenditures on the army, payments for soldiers and their families, expenditures on the defense sector, and the fact that Russia before has shifted its economy to a war mode, allowing it to largely neutralize the effects of Western sanctions, but this leads to inflation. For these reasons, which I mentioned and cited here from the Moscow Times, in recent months, the heads of Russian companies have complained about rising bank loan costs. Oh yes, therefore also investments, which they believe leads to a limitation of economic growth, especially in sectors unrelated to the defense industry. Well, in the defense industry, you will get some state guarantees and negotiate something, it will be somewhat okay. But if it's a consumer loan, the equivalent of $500, for an ordinary Ivan, the interest rate increase was 47.5%. It is currently 51%. So we are talking about the real annual interest rate. Not bad, right? Companies probably have it a bit easier, but how much easier? Not really. But we will talk about that later. The newspaper Le Monde recently emphasized that the economy of death, in which Russia is currently embraced, drives economic growth in Russia, but only and exclusively in what we remind bombs, rockets, bullets, cannons, and similar things that are being disposed of in the sunflower fields of Ukraine, as well as in the fields of Russia. Let's not forget about Kursk. According to the Parisian newspaper, large expenditures on the arms industry, soldiers' salaries and compensations, which are also weak, and benefits for the families of the deceased are also weak, creating a financial bubble that prolongs the war, but the injection of money that reaches consumers increases demand, but also overheats the Russian economy, causing inflation to rise. Definitely. Certain simple rules of economics are relentless. And further, we have, and again, we will focus a bit on the Bank of Russia, because we won't stray far from it today, as there is another mega important declaration coming from the management of this bank. Do you remember how much panic there always was on this topic, like a symbol, and for $1, 100 rubles? This is a certain psychological barrier in Russia, or at least it was. The Russian authorities announced that they will no longer try to prevent the ruble from falling below 100 against the US dollar, as they expect that a low exchange rate will benefit the state budget in connection with plans for more military spending. Such information was provided by Bloomberg last Tuesday, citing two anonymous sources familiar with the situation. We once explained, with Paweł Jozowski, how and why inflation is beneficial for the budget in certain matters, as it allows them to roll over certain things, shift responsibility and costs onto others, and continue to function. But it also has its limitations and time. Shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian central bank introduced capital controls to limit the impact of Western sanctions. Rising energy prices and a collapse in imports. This move indeed helped the ruble become the best performing currency in the world for most of 2022, after it fell below the psychological threshold of 100 against the dollar in the initial weeks following the outbreak of the war. There were numerous interventions in the foreign exchange market to maintain a rational exchange rate against the dollar from the perspective of the Russian central bank and government. But it seems that the resources have been quite depleted, as the welfare fund, which was collected for about 20 years, has been plundered. However, the ruble began to move with greater volatility in terms of its price in 2023, when Europe halted Russian oil and gas imports, and the G7 imposed a price cap on Russian oil and petroleum products. Since then, the Russian central bank has raised interest rates several times, and Putin ordered 43 key companies to sell part of their foreign currency reserves on the domestic market, and it was precisely this forced exchange of currencies for rubles that saved, so to speak, at the expense of the central bank, the ruble's exchange rate on the domestic market against the dollar and other currencies. In the current situation, however, 100 rubles for a dollar is not so terrifying, although it has a certain inflationary effect. This was stated by former representative of the Bank of Russia, Oleg Vyugin, as quoted by Bloomberg. We will see how long this will last for them. The ruble recently fell by 9% against the dollar and 11% against the Chinese yuan, which Russia has increasingly used over the past 2 years, after American sanctions against the Moscow Stock Exchange prompted a halt to trading in dollars and euros in June of this year. The Russian Ministry of Economic Development forecasts that the ruble is worth an average of 96.5% against $1, and these are the plans as for the year 2025, but for the current year, they estimate it to be 91.2%, and that such a thing will be maintained until the end of this year, which I doubt, because I bet that 23% rates will still be caught this calendar year, although there are those who, in discussion with me, indicated that they are betting on a full quarter of 25%. Well, we will see. For now, it's Bell 21. Meanwhile, the Russian central bank may raise its key interest rate again next Wednesday. So, what can I say? We cheer for the bubble in Russia to grow, because if the bubble grows strong enough, its weight increases and it can pull the head down. It can also make breathing difficult. Why not? And currently, as a result, the Russian Ministry of Finance, with the strength of the Chinese economy in the background, here, the Russian Ministry of Finance and the central bank have increased the sale of the Chinese yuan on the domestic currency market to 8.4 billion rubles daily since October. And this is to last until November 7th. So just a few more days, making a net intervention of 5.3 billion rubles in the sale of the yuan. And Renaissance Capital wrote about this at the beginning of October, which is almost a month ago. In a separate report, the portal The Bell stated that the Russian domestic market experienced a liquidity shortage of the yuan in the summer. This was also mentioned as some large exporters turned to borrowing, entirely and exclusively in yuan, due to the interest rates in rubles, which were then approaching 20% and have now exceeded 20%. In May of this year, the share of transactions involving the yuan on the Moscow exchange reached 54% and was increasing. After the US sanctions were imposed on the exchange this summer, this number rose to 99.8%. For comparison, before the full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, over 80% of currency transactions were in US dollars and the remainder in euros. That's quite a significant change, isn't it? In 2024, the average interest rate on loans for businesses in rubles for large borrowers was approximately 17.17%. And this was for approximately one-year loans, and 1474 for longer-term loans. The interest rates on loans denominated in yuan are significantly lower and have so far been at 7.11% and 8% respectively. Transactions involving the yuan on the Moscow Stock Exchange reached 54% and were increasing. After the imposition of US sanctions on the stock exchange this summer, this number increased to 99.8%. For comparison, before the full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, over 80% of currency transactions were in US dollars, and the rest in euros. That's quite a significant entity, isn't it? In 2024, the average interest rate on loans for businesses in rubles. For large borrowers, it was 17.17%. And that was for one-year loans and 14.74% for longer loans. The interest rates on loans denominated in yuan are significantly lower and respectively, they have been at 7.11% and 8%, and 79% of loans taken in yuan were for a period of less than 1 year, which means a higher interest rate. But in the summer of this year, the Russian currency market faced a severe liquidity shortage of yuan, as the demand for the Chinese currency exceeded the supply, and banks could not cover their open currency positions. This liquidity shortage peaked in September, and the one-day yuan repo rate rose to over 212% on some trading days. Do you feel what a significant spread that was? In the meantime, the Russian central bank reportedly increased the cost of currency swaps between the ruble and yuan. In September, the deputy governor of the central bank, Alexei Zabotkin, argued that swaps should not be used by banks to solve their own financial problems under the false pretext of addressing liquidity issues, because it is a tool that should be used by the central bank. And what? Liquidity is the bank's ability to make payments in the currency required by the client, while funding refers to the balance structure between deposits and loans in a specific currency. This is where the ball is. On the bank's field, they must ensure that their lending activities align with their ability to attract currency liabilities, Zabotkin argued, suggesting that banks acquire the currency they need. However, in this way, enough yuan would accumulate in Russia to create a deposit base for the currency. Well, it is unclear whether this actually succeeded, but rather not. Moreover, the liquidity of the yuan may be disrupted by major over-indebtedness issues, such as the Rosneft bonds denominated in yuan worth a trivial 15 billion rubles, which matured for redemption in September. And let's remember that banks are also trying to accumulate yuan to cover Rosneft's liabilities for this reason. So the situation is quite dynamic, and it does not seem that it will be easier for Russia in this regard. Yuan was a salvation that can now become a thorn around Blythe's neck. And some things in Russia definitely do not go well with the Chinese. One of the things that they were supposed to do together, that is, mixed capital companies, was a large Russian-Chinese coal mining project in Siberia. Let's also remember that there was supposed to be the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline, LNG, in the north in the Arctic, and everything is falling into danger one after another. So this Russian-Chinese coal project, and also regarding decarbonization, Well, no one will throw statistics at them, although they are juggling with statistics, but they won't throw at them what is being done in Russia for them in the coal mining sector. And here I would recommend to a few colleagues and organizations to significantly limit their admiration for Chinese decarbonization. Indeed, this joint coal mining project is struggling with financing difficulties due to secondary sanctions on secondary payments to Russia. The CEO of the Russian metals and renewable energy giant Enplas said Thursday the USA expanded its secondary sanctions against Russia in June, giving the Treasury Department the authority to penalize foreign banks conducting business with Russia. The coal deposit in Zauzhansky, the largest in the Russian Transbaikal region, is being developed by the company Razrezugo. The joint venture was established between Enplas and China Energy Investment Corporation on a parity basis. The task at this forum is to continue the discussion about this project and to try to expedite and resolve any of our issues. They are related to financing and restrictions on the use of financial resources, said Enplas CEO Vladimir Kolmogorov on the RBC website at the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok. Because such a forum was recently held to save the interests of Russian companies, whether they are own projects or those jointly implemented with other countries, especially Chinese companies. And unfortunately, Chinese colleagues are afraid of these secondary sanctions and are holding back on such investments. Do I regret it? Not at all. But let's remember, Russian elites can become radicalized. Here, this radicalism has caused them to radically decide to defend their interests at this moment. Yes, Russian elites and big business feel growing anxiety about this ongoing war. Well, how could it not be so? Since even the head of a state corporation like Russia says, don't take our people from production, take them from elsewhere. And there is definitely a shortage of people. This ongoing war with Ukraine and the sanctions have clearly already hit, they say, Russian businessmen, and they are increasingly less afraid to talk about it. It has impacted the Russian economy. Although the Kremlin still promotes an optimistic image of the situation, experts point out real problems and upcoming tax changes, and larger players in the Polish market are increasingly writing about it. For example, as in this case, the war in Ukraine, which has brought Russia a record number of sanctions, has resulted in 600,000 casualties. Now we are talking about realistically over 700,000, counting those I include, both I and Marek Meissner include, the Luhansk, Donetsk, Wagner forces, and various shadow battalions from the Caucasus. So we are currently at around 780,790. But the Ukrainian General Staff estimates that it is currently 697,000 casualties. For the first time, the U.S. Department of Defense, Lloyd Austin, said that it is over 500,000, and yet it still raises the number of soldiers. So this war instills fear among Russian officials, and businessmen are tired of the conflict, but its end also overwhelms them along the way. These officials, however, earn such amounts that fear is fear, but the benefits to avoid conscription into the army and various actions against monopolies are substantial. Well, perhaps so. We have repeatedly stated with Powell that Russian corruption is doing better than very well and continues to develop. It is unclear how to live after this special military operation, which is also one of the concerns. Even people from the president's administration, as reported in its study by Onet, uncertainty affects the Russian business that has lost Western markets due to sanctions. Friendly countries such as China and Turkey partially adhere to the restrictions, which complicates the return to normalcy. They will complain, for example, to the Medusa portal. I remind you that just recently, Lavrov said that he does not understand how it is that this Turkey, which is trying so hard to be a mediator, is somehow cooperating with Russia, yet still supplies weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. And what can he say? He can only say that he does not understand, because he is unable to influence Turkey. Because if Turkey were to restrict everything it allows its companies in relations with Russia, who would suffer more, Russia or Turkey? Furthermore, Putin's grand economic projects promising a sovereign future remain on paper. Factories are not producing airplanes, shipyards are not starting the production of tankers due to a lack of technology. Gas pipelines are not being built, oil pipelines are not being built, liquefied natural gas and other products of this type are not being produced in such quantities. Generally, there is stagnation in Russian business, especially in the civil and energy sectors, and uncertainty is increasingly affecting it. All these projects, one after another, they are being thwarted by secondary sanctions. And experts warn that the end of the war could be just as painful for the economy as the conflict itself, because defense spending reaches over 6% of GDP. These are the official figures. And their halt raises questions about the future of the factories and the workers who went in that direction to meet these Russian needs in this regard. Be afraid, be very afraid of this rightly, and it won't get better. And who else has recently caused significant reflux for Putin? Well, that Finland, which beautifully broke free from the Russian leash years ago, is now doing a delicate job adding to it every possible time, hitting the paws of the Russian bear. And it hits with something like that, so the bear can't just swipe its paw, because it will hurt even more. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has just summoned the Finnish ambassador for a meeting to express strong opposition to the Finnish court's decision to seize Russian assets worth $4.25 billion. The confiscation was carried out at the request of the Ukrainian company Naftogaz, which demands compensation for lost property in Crimea. Everything is in accordance with the law. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs reacted to the Finnish authorities' seizure of 45 properties belonging to the Russian Federation. According to the Russian side, among the seized properties are also buildings covered by diplomatic immunity used by the Russian embassy for official purposes. A representative of Russian diplomacy conveyed to the Finnish ambassador that this unlawful decision, which clearly violates the provisions of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961, should be reversed as soon as possible. Russia also warned that if there is no response from Helsinki, it will take retaliatory actions. Meanwhile, the Finnish-Russian border is closed until further notice. Finnish enforcement services seized several dozen valuable properties located in different parts of the country. Among the seized properties were estates in the Åland Islands, very important islands, an office residential complex in Helsinki, and exclusive residences located by the Gulf of Finland, which were used by Russian diplomatic staff. Earlier, the Finnish Enforcement Agency also seized the prestigious Central Science and Culture building in the heart of Helsinki, which was owned by the Russian Federation. The legal basis is the arbitration ruling from The Hague from April of last year. The tribunal ordered Russia to pay over 5 billion euros in compensation to the Ukrainian company Naftogaz. The compensation concerns losses incurred by the Ukrainian company as a result of the annexation of Crimea in 2014, when it lost control over its facilities and raw material reserves on the island. In the absence of a response from the Russian side, the Ukrainian company began efforts to freeze and seize Russian assets in various countries. The actions taken in Finland are part of this international enforcement campaign. Does anyone have doubts about the correctness of this? After all, they took the assets of this Ukrainian company. That is a fact. It was theft. So there is a claim for compensation. As far as I'm concerned, everything is legal. Let's remember that in wartime, unfortunately, services support their country's industry wherever possible. In this case, the services supported quite strongly and unfortunately effectively, but in what way? Russian companies, with the help of services, were able to buy spare parts for outdated microchip production machines produced by the Dutch technology giant ASML through, unfortunately, Chinese intermediaries. Because since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as reported by the Dutch newspaper Trouw, it has been impossible, but now they have finally succeeded. Succeeded because apparently someone did not keep track of the old technologies from the 90s. So we are talking about technologies that are over 30, closer to 100 years old. The smallest Russian importers reportedly obtained these parts at least 170 times between February 22 and December 23rd. The newspaper noted that Russian trading companies were still sourcing countless spare parts on the secondary market as well. The imported parts are suitable for ASML machines built until the late 90s and in the early 2000s, which according to the report remain very useful for chips in everyday devices and weapons. And this may explain part of the secrets related to having some stock of chips for weapon production. Although tools from that era are not considered significant or this technology is not deemed important, the potential military application has almost been forgotten. The Dutch newspaper suggested that they may still be used for the production of missiles, drones, tanks, and military vehicles in Russia, as everything there is significantly delayed. And ASML is one of the world's leading manufacturers of semiconductor chip production equipment used in everything from mobile phones to cars. At the beginning of this year, this corporation announced that it cannot export a limited number of advanced machines to China, where it generated about half of its revenue. This is all related to pressure from the US government on the Dutch authorities. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Moscow has faced Western export restrictions on advanced semiconductors and other dual-use or military goods, including microchips, for missiles and drones. Earlier reports from Ukrainian media indicated that the import of ASML equipment is essential to maintain and expand Russian military production, but no one thought it was about equipment from the 90s. Unfortunately, the Russian services somewhat deceived the West here. So it was something they succeeded in, so it's not that they are failing. And now we have beautiful data regarding Russia's GDP versus interest rates. For a long time, let's take this into account. The Russian government subsidized mortgages. They had that whim, well, why not? The welfare fund and similar things existed. Now, on the other hand, to buy a studio apartment in Russia, one has to spend even 5 times more. And all this happened within 3 years. So, it has, according to journalists from the Moscow Times, the charge of a bomb that will eventually explode. Not only in Poland are apartments and mortgages expensive because in Russia, most mortgages were granted last year under programs where the state applied special interest rates. This led to an increase in apartment prices as well as loan installments. Nevertheless, Russians are diving in massively, even though monthly payments exceed the average salary in Moscow. Every additional percent in the rate means an increase in payments by several thousand rubles, depending on the term of the loan and its other conditions. Over the long years of the mortgage, that amounts to tens of millions of rubles in excess. The Moscow Times, with the help of bank mortgage calculators, calculated how much the price of an apartment increases with such a mortgage. Over the past year, most mortgage loans have been granted under preferential programs in which the interest rates were subsidized by the state. These programs, under which about 70% of loans were granted, peaked at 85% in June, caused price increases, and consequently, an increase in mortgage payments. So it inflated. Did it affect inflation? Not at all. Since July, the most popular preferential mortgage has been completely cancelled, and the remaining ones have been restructured. Currently, half of the mortgages are granted under these programs. Prices have been frozen, and the main factor for the increase in payments is the interest rate, and that is rising. Indeed, the government has intervened to prevent loan prices from rising, and the price is not increasing. Only the interest rate for loans is rising. and that is not subject to freezing. The monthly mortgage payment for an apartment in Moscow worth 10 million rubles, which is 410,000 PLN, at the current exchange rate in recent weeks, on average, with a 20% down payment of 2 million Dagesh rubles, which is 82,000 PLN, will range from 143.5 to 164.5 thousand rubles monthly mortgage payment. And what is the average salary in Russia? 70,000. Converting that to Polish, it is between 5,800 and 6,700 zlotys with cents. Even by Polish standards, that is a lot. With a 15-year mortgage and from 137 to 166,000 rubles, which is a range of 5,600 to 6,800 with a 30-year mortgage. This is suggested by the mortgage calculators of major Russian banks. And this is a very budget option for you, the apartment. According to the IRN Russia service, 10 million rubles costs a one-room apartment with an area of 37 square meters in an old panel building 10 minutes by metro from the city center. It is comparable. The average salary of a resident of Moscow in June was 150,000 rubles, and if you subtract 13% personal income tax, 133,000 will remain, which is too little to repay a 30-year loan with an interest rate of 20.5%, as it has been so far. But it cannot be lower than the basic reference rate of the central bank, so it must also rise here. However, according to the Moscow State Statistics Service, such a Mostat exists. There are industries mainly related to IT computers, where the average salary exceeds 200,000 rubles, which is over 8,100 PLN. This was defined by Mikhail Matovnikov, the chief analyst at Sberbank, estimating that about 11% of the country's population has tripled their income in 2 years. This is only possible because they are beneficiaries of this war. Over 15 years of repaying a mortgage for an apartment worth 10 million rubles, 30 million rubles will accumulate, which is a starting point of 410,000 PLN at purchase, and when settling at the end, after 15 years, it is between 1 million and 1,200,000 PLN. Not bad, right? However, according to the central bank, the most common mortgage repayment period is about 30 years. In the first half of the year, over 40% of mortgages were granted for 25-30 years, and almost 20% for 30-31 years. Over 30 years of repayment in the example discussed here, the fees will amount to between 49 to 60 million rubles, meaning that the apartment taken for 410,000 PLN over 30 years will return between 2,200,000 and 2.5 million PLN. Well, not bad, not bad, but that was before the interest rate hike, so now it will be even more. This means the overpayment will be almost double the loan amount for 15 years. That's right. And from 3.9 to 5 times in the case of a 30-year loan. Ouch. But this does not deter Russians. They are still actively borrowing even at the current rates, and in July and August, after cuts in preferential programs, banks issued about 170 billion rubles, almost 7 billion PLN monthly, in loans at market conditions. Many people do not intend to repay the mortgage for the entire 30 years, not even for 15 years. They assume by definition that they will manage to do it faster if their income allows it, or thanks to state subsidies, or the sale of an old apartment, if the loan is taken to improve living conditions. This is how Russians approach it. Is this some kind of optimism, or is it just the principle that the state gives us, that it pays us? Salary, we pretend to pay taxes. According to data from the central bank, in the first half of the year, Russians were making early repayments on mortgages of about 140 billion, which is almost 6 billion PLN, each month. How is that possible? Oh, maybe they were those officials from the draft commissions, military, from the recruitment offices, other officials. If we looked closely at this structure, it could be very interesting, right? But now let's take a look at inflation. It is important to pay attention to how price increases look. The currently set monthly installment will decrease in real terms each year due to inflation. If we start from the inflation target of 4, prices set by the central bank will increase by 80% over 15 years and 3.2 times over 30 years. However, it is hard to believe that this goal is achievable. I no longer believe it on the bullets. With an average annual inflation rate of 6%, prices will increase 2.4 times over 15 years and almost 6 times over 30 years. And with 8% inflation, from 3.2 times to over 10 times. If we take into account the decrease in the real amount of payments, the overpayment for an apartment will amount to 60% of its value over 15 years at 8% inflation, to 140% of its value at 4% inflation. Over 30 years, the real overpayment will range from 90% to 2.6 times its value. Ultimately, mortgage interest rates are significantly higher than inflation. Alexei Vedyev, a leading researcher at the Gaidar Institute's Financial Research Laboratory, called mortgage interest rates at 20% and higher an absolute bomb that will explode. This is a classic case where income growth stops, and a mortgage at 20% has already been taken out and must continue to be repaid. So, the prevalence of the debt spiral. I suppose that's what you could call it. And in general, to have creditworthiness, one needs to earn currently about 14,000 zlotys in Moscow. To have the ability, so they did it, but the sanctions are not working. Remember, they are not working. The Russian economy is permanently growing. However, there is one thing. Why are Russians buying these apartments? Because they have no other way to withdraw their money outside of Russia. I would call it a kind of fatalism. But housing prices in Russia are soaring, and the sanctions have amplified the effect of government subsidies. Apartment prices in the latest Russian data, prices for apartments in the largest Russian cities have increased by 172% over the last 3 years. We haven't seen such madness here. This is the effect of the subsidy program for loans. Russia has recently been experiencing a 3-digit increase in housing prices with such changes in the real estate market. The issue was reported by the money portal citing The Economist. The Economist analyzed it quite specifically. According to estimates cited by the British Weekly, property prices in the largest cities of the country had no breaks at all. That 172% is simply shocking. In recent years, Russians have been much more willing to use the program, as the result of Western sanctions left them with few options for investing their capital abroad. That's why they started, as I mentioned earlier, to invest in real estate. Russia introduced the mortgage subsidy program in 2020 in response to the COVID pandemic. As Bloomberg pointed out, the program was intended to stimulate demand and encourage developers to maintain construction production. However, the government's withdrawal from the costly program brought further effects. The inflated prices of apartments due to government subsidies are now gone, and only market prices remain. So, at this moment, it drives the inflation spiral even more strongly. Clients of the Safe Credit Program could take out a loan for an apartment at a specified interest rate. The state covered the difference between this interest rate and the actual costs of the loan. In July, the interest rate offered in the program was 8%, which was half of the current base interest rate in Russia. Yes, it is now almost 3 times lower, July, and we are in November. But in reality, all the changes occurred in October. As Bloomberg points out, the head of the central bank criticized, currently in Russia, the base interest rate is almost 3 times lower than in July, and we are in November. But in reality, all changes occurred in October. As Bloomberg indicates, the head of the central bank criticized the program for distorting the impact of subsidies on the prices of newly built properties, but no one was listening to her. Support. For most of the properties built so far, and for banks, is not available. The real estate market, which was one of the key factors driving the Russian economy during the war, is facing months of uncertainty, as Bloomberg delicately puts it. In 2023, real estate purchases accounted for about 11% of the Russian economy, with a total value of 18 million rubles, approximately 813 billion zlotys. Three-quarters of new housing loans were taken out thanks to this program. And after the subsidies were removed, Russian banks currently offer housing loans, or rather they offered them for about 17 to 20, and at this moment it will be more. One must add the interest rate plus how much. Well, I think that without 5% there won't be a conversation. So, 26, let me think about how we assess the real inflation rate in Russia, which is estimated at 30% this year. I think it's starting to fit together somehow. In June, the average price per square meter in Moscow, and Moscow is a huge area with great diversity, was around 366,400 rubles per meter, which gives a price of 16,500 zlotys. This is the average, but there are very few prices below it. However, there are many more prices that are even higher, especially as you get closer to the city center. So, congratulations. And on top of all this, additional data comes in. Look, the interest rates on bank loans, how they have risen, the rate shown here for each month. And that is already history. In August, it was 19. The same. Largest price changes compiled by Rosstat using Moscow as an example. Differences between the years 2023 and 2024. Basic products, potatoes. 29.9 rubles per kilogram, 44.5, plus almost 49%. Garlic. Tomatoes, onions, olive, oil. Most falls within the range of 20 to 30%. Significant. Milk, 17%. Lamb around. Bread, 20%. And now you have independent price researchers and the assessment of Rosstat. Let's see how it looks. Rosstat, potatoes, 48.9. On this similar goal, indicated similar data. Cabbage, however, according to Rosstat, is only just under 15%, while according to independents, it is 45%. Lamb, 45%. According to Rosstat, just under 30%. Cucumbers, 30% up. According to Rosstat, 12%. So in short, Rosstat is clearly cheating. And pineapples. Apparently, the price has even dropped. I don't see it that way. So this is clear evidence that Rosstat provides the prices it was told to provide, not the ones that actually exist. The average difference between what independent sources present and the official data is several, nice percentage points, but sometimes significantly more. Compared to the previous year, the calculated average is 14.4 in the positive regarding the indicators, while here it is just under 12 according to the official data. Is it possible? Yes, it is. How was it, right? The whole truth is crap. The truth is statistics and official data, but there are also things that supposedly got cheaper. Tangerines, down almost 7%. Well done. Candies, down almost 5%. Well done. Premium flour allegedly also dropped by 1%, along with other products, even sugar and buckwheat. But what has increased? Chickens. The chicken scandals have already been described. sausages in sauce, teas, so on and so forth. But not everything is included in the official data in their baskets. And what is so special about those Moscow apartments and offices? The bubble that bursts here could cause quite a stir. And may it happen. The great father of the nation keeps his finger on the pulse. Well, he does, right? Because he does, right? And Russia is constantly developing and has no problems, right? Everything I have mentioned absolutely confirms that Putin is keeping the healthy Russian economy in good hands and even pushing it forward. So why not? However, an article appeared in the Polish newspaper Parkiet stating that the Russian economy can endure a lot after all. Yes, it can endure a lot. A centrally managed, recovering economy can sustain many things, but for how long? After all, the Soviet Union also stumbled over its own feet. Here, Parkett reported that the forecasts about a rapid economic catastrophe of Putin's state was a manifestation of wishful thinking, and the armed conflict has actually started to drive and heat up the Russian economy. This is an example that someone writing this is probably sitting in a certain information bubble, because what pertains only to the war economy is being attempted to be stretched to the entire economy, and I have now provided a whole list of examples showing that this is not possible. So, when the Russian central bank was making further rate hikes, it seems that someone there missed it, but a fact is a fact. Let's remember, thanks to totalitarian actions, the Russian economy prolongs its state of agony and somehow continues to function. And there is even a seemingly economic growth based solely on tools related to generating death. Only and exclusively and solely and in this particular context. According to data cited by the author of the article from the newspaper Parkiet, Russian economic growth will be 3.2%. Well, he wasn't the only one that mattered, as it was also shown on the graph earlier. And in the second quarter, it increased by 4% after a rise of 5.4% achieved in the first 3 months of the year. The International Monetary Fund, which predicted this, believes that the Russian growth for the entire year will be 3.2%. This is already 3 institutions that forecast such a thing. It's quite a decent result, theoretically. The unemployment rate in Russia was only 2.4% in July and was record low. So why do they now have to hire, or rather have announced a hiring program at all costs for victims, disabled individuals from the special military operation? Maybe mainly in parking lots, but nonetheless, they are re-entering the sector rather for productive use in the economy. Probably because everything is super in the economy. So, moving on. In 2022, the unemployment rate reached 4.4%. The decrease in unemployment is easily explained by the fact that hundreds of thousands of men have been subjected to successive waves of mobilization, and the industry is flooded with war orders. As of January 2022, the average salary in the Russian industry was 53,000 rubles per month, while in June of this year it reached 85,000 rubles. So in terms of conversion, an increase from 2,200 PLN to 3,600 PLN. And of course, this has nothing to do with inflation, right? These earnings may still seem relatively low, but over the past few years, they have nearly doubled, which of course has positively influenced the perception of the regime by Russians. However, what they received in their pay was supposed to be better, even more. They had to give back more in stores. In March, the real wage increase reached as much as 13% year on year. But later, the accelerating inflation began to make itself felt. In June, this growth slowed down to 6%, and in the 20th. Some analysts indicate that one of the sources of Russian economic growth is the very process of adapting to Western sanctions. There is growth in sectors where Russia is trying to replace or has replaced imports that usually came from the West with its own production. However, the imports coming from China have been completely overlooked. And at the same time, it very effectively undermines Russian producers as they are unable to compete. Someone forgot about this. Many Western analysts believe that the Russian economy will face great problems, regardless of whether the war ends quickly or drags on for a long time. This view is understandable, but it is possible that the draconian sanctions may stimulate the development of certain sectors of the economy. That's what the analysts write. Taram, 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 Taram. Remember which bank still doesn't want to leave Russia. Raiffeisen International. And who wrote that this is a stimulant for the economy? Analysts from Raiffeisen Capital Management. Can one unthinkingly quote these analysts in such a matter in a serious newspaper like Parkiet? But are the sanctions imposed on Russia really that draconian? Not quite yet, in my opinion, but let's keep watching. Perhaps they would have hit Russia much harder if all of them had been introduced at once. Bingo. But that wasn't the case. Escalation management made in Germany bows. Unfortunately, they are not entirely airtight. Well, unfortunately, you can find schemas everywhere. After all, Russia traded quite freely with China during this period, of course, and only in recent months have Chinese banks started to withdraw from settling trade transactions with Russia to avoid violating another package of American sanctions. Russia also benefited from the trade mediation of various entities. Exactly. And here we have countries like Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. This is also not easy to hide. The Russian economy benefits not only from such schemes that allow for circumvention, but also from completely legal exports of energy resources to many countries that either do not recognize the sanctions or take advantage of exceptions to them. According to calculations by the Central Research Institute for Energy and Clean Air, REA, since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has generated nearly 747 billion euros in revenue from fossil fuel exports. But this does not translate into profit. Let's remember, this is the basis for tax calculations and so on. Of this amount, 202 billion went to the European Union, 200 to China, 105 to India, nearly 82 to Turkey, and almost 30 to Germany. The export of these resources to Poland was worth just under 11 billion euros, which is less than to Slovakia and a bit more than to Singapore. In calculations for the period from January 1st, 2023, the European Union dropped to fourth place with just over 50 billion euros. China surpassed it with 135 billion, India with 80, and Turkey with 55 billion. Poland, Germany, and Italy were excluded from the ranking of countries, and Hungary became the largest European recipient of Russian fossil fuels with an amount of 7.5 billion euros. One can take comfort in the fact that Russia has lost the lucrative European market, but someone here forgot that with the transit means it is unable to. What remains, because it is not sold to the EU, cannot be physically redirected to India, China, and the rest of the world. I would say the use of data is very selective. Fortunately, all of this can be commented on and clarified. However, one cannot deny the statement from Parkiet that the Russian economy has also suffered losses, some of which will only become more visible in the long term. A significant portion of Russia's foreign reserves has been frozen as a result of sanctions. The Moscow capital market has been cut off from foreign investors, and foreign direct investment in Russia has fallen to zero. And this was acknowledged by Nabulina herself, the head of the central bank. However, these economic damages are not yet significant enough to compel the Kremlin to halt military actions or provoke a rebellion among the Russian population. Well, the resilience of the Russian population is low. This population is currently either passive, as seen in the Kursk region, where it neither resists nor shows support for the anti-motivational opposition. And Kirilo Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, stated that the year 2025 will be crucial for Russia. We are saying, in short, we said this earlier, we are glad that someone like, well, really, a wise guy, says the same as we do. By the middle of next year, socioeconomic problems of the aggressor state are expected to become more pronounced for sure, and issues with soldier recruitment, which are already present, will arise. If a victory in Ukraine can be achieved by the first months of 2026, it will undermine Russia's aspirations to remain a global superpower for the next 30 years, Budanov said. So Budanov assumes fighting will continue until the beginning of 2026. Hopefully, Ukraine has the resources for that. Well, we are also one of the sources of those resources. When the invasion began, few people predicted that the war could last until 2026. Well, next year will be crucial. So we will see. By the end, maybe in 2025, they still have resources. In total, counting all those depots, they will dig out every last usable shell of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and other equipment. Let us remember that Russia is trying to pump in the last billions. Now, the slogan is that they will print money for some $70 billion, 7 million rubles, already counting at about 100 rubles per house. And the Russian government is preparing for a radical increase in spending in principle across the board. Bloomberg reported at the beginning of October that in 2025, the Kremlin will spend a record amount of over 13 million rubles, which is $142 billion, on national defense. As calculated by the Moscow Times, the war with Russia has already cost Russian rescuers over 22 million rubles, so now we are converting. Since 13 million is $142 billion now. With average prices at 22 million rubles, I think we can safely multiply by 2. So, the war with Russia currently costs $280 billion. Huge costs. The destruction they caused in Ukraine is another matter, but it has cost Russia this much. The Bloomberg agency obtained the draft budget bill, which is soon to be submitted. Well, sorry, it has already been submitted and went through the first reading. So this radical increase is indeed a fact. And besides that, there will be more because this is a public pool. So, for comparison, this year the Kremlin officially allocated 10.8 million rubles for national defense, while in 2023 it was only 6.8, and all of this has been exceeded. On average, it increased by 3 million, meaning there has been an average budget deficit of over 3 million each year, which totals 13 million. With the current inflation, it is not enough. So, the military budget will theoretically officially consume 6.5% of the country's GDP, but the share of military spending is supposed to be 30%, an unprecedented level since the USSR. And it is a fiction, because realistically, it is thus. So, let's not forget that, for example, the total amount of such expenditures will increase by 16%. And this is not only for the army, because as much as for the army itself, it is supposed to go. 13.2 trillion. The government will spend another 3.5 trillion under the national security category, which includes the police, the National Guard, the Investigative Committee, Special Services, and other law enforcement agencies. So in total, the army and security forces will consume 40% of the official budget, amounting to 16.7 trillion rubles. The Kremlin also plans to freeze budget expenditures on healthcare, or rather is already implementing it. At the current year level, 1.6 trillion rubles and a significant reduction in budget expenditures on social assistance to the population, including pension and benefit payments. In 2025, only 6.8 trillion rubles will be allocated for these purposes, which is $700 billion less than this year. Expenditures on education, according to the budget proposal, are theoretically set to increase slightly, but that is because spending on everything related to military training, that is, pro-defense, is increasing. The government anticipates a noticeable increase of 10% or 400 billion rubles in the national economy category, which will include funds for mega projects and assistance for state corporations. Which state corporations need help? Well, those that are struggling to meet production needs for the special military operation. So, I just gave you a big rundown of all these myths, wonders, and so on. Good Russian PR, because they know how to do PR, and what. And such things indeed encourage children to remind their parents that they need to sacrifice for the good of the motherland. And he shows the course in which all of this is supposed to go, so that Russians can live better. Am I sure we can handle this ourselves? Evaluate and consider that this winter may not be kind, because look, Chita, the Chita region, 75, Russian winter has already arrived there and it will hold well. Trolley buses can't cope. And the spare part situation isn't great either. I'm curious how the fuel will behave if it's gasoline that has such a quantity of biocomponent additives in the form of theoretically anhydrous alcohol. But is it really? Then there will be wonders happening, right? And this is not the only video of the situation. Of course, to make it clear that it's not better here, winter has also surprised the road workers there. And if it snows here, it probably won't be any better. Where is Chita? Chita is here. So if it becomes hard for them to live within what Russia provides, where will they look for something that can improve their lives? Oh, the border with China is not far from here, right? And this is happening. And here I greet my colleague from the bank. It's so good. It's so good. Moscow is providing such money to increase the absorption of those willing to join the Russian army to sign a contract that unfortunately another metro line is falling out of the investment plan because there is not enough money for it. I know someone will say we only have 2/3 in preparation in Warsaw. Okay, well, we started much later. It was no longer possible to do this in a centrally managed state. It's different now. Everything costs. The budget of Warsaw is also flexible, but our design work is progressing, while there it had to slow down. But remember, the sanctions are not working. I don't know which of his doubles this is, but I consider it one of the less flattering photos. Everyone can recall various photos depicting, how should I put it, a vision of what our distant ancestors looked like. And this is the Russian future. This is how they see it. And that's why they will reform the education system to shorten the time to maturity, because this Russian youth is much more aware of the world. So why not give them a chance to serve their family, their community, faster? And a great text by Krzysztof Wojciech. So events will accelerate after everything I have provided you, and after the increase in interest rates, which has not yet ended this year, announcing the release of more money for another printing, because this is not the first time. To such an extent as 7 million rubles, that's almost half of what they plan to allocate for the military. Well, that's nice. If there is mass printing in Russia, then they already know they have lost economically. I outlined a resolution in Ukraine by 2027. Of course, it's just a game, a lottery, and please treat it that way. However, I would shorten the perspective now by a year to 2026. Putin will want to beat the sticks. We will see. I believe it is quite an accurate diagnosis, supported by everything I have cited for you, so you can assess for yourselves who is more right. And that would be all for this additional meeting on purely economic grounds, showing you what the facts are, what the myths are, so you can assess them for yourselves. I already have my opinion. How about you? I am waiting for comments. To everyone, so until we hear from each other, see you. I encourage you to like, comment, share, subscribe to the Kapitan Lisowski channel, give advice on advertisements, support the channel in every way described on the channel, and to all those who support it, thank you very much, because it is thanks to you that such independent materials can be published. I can analyze, interpret, translate from their language to ours. And I feel quite good about it. So I warmly greet you this weekend, the first of the longer weekends this month, with another one coming soon. Take care until we hear from each other. See you. Bye.